My name is Stella, and I am 33 years old. As a wealth management director, I handle millions of dollars every day, but nothing prepared me for the text message I received from my mother at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. "We have agreed that you are no longer part of this family," she wrote. "Do not come to Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow. You are too selfish to support your brother." My brother Preston simply liked the message. His wife Jasmine, an African-American lifestyle influencer who constantly flaunted her supposed wealth online, quickly chimed in. "To be honest, Stella, your toxic energy just ruins the family vibe. Please stay away." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type out a paragraph begging for their forgiveness. I simply replied, "Thanks for confirming. Enjoy the holiday." Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their entire fake lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who saw you as nothing more than a personal bank account. As I sat in the quiet of my home office, the reality of their betrayal washed over me. For 4 long years, I had been the invisible foundation holding up their lavish lifestyle. Growing up in a wealthy Connecticut suburb, my mother Patricia cared only about social status. My father Richard was a weak man who simply nodded along to keep the peace. Preston was their undeniable golden child. He was a charismatic grifter who called himself an entrepreneur, moving from one failed startup to another. I remembered being 23 years old, working grueling hours at a basic junior finance job. I lived in a freezing basement apartment, eating dollar store ramen noodles every single night just to afford my student loan payments. That exact same winter, my mother bought Preston a $10,000 Rolex watch. When I asked her how she could afford it, she told me Preston needed the right accessories for networking and that I simply did not understand the business world. I understood business perfectly. That is why I climbed the corporate ladder while Preston sank deeper into debt. When his bad decisions threatened to leave my parents homeless 4 years ago, they came crying to me. I stepped in and quietly took over their massive expenses to save them from public humiliation. I paid for everything. I funded the perfect image they projected to their country club friends. And now, because I finally refused to pour more money into Preston's latest crypto scam, I was being thrown away like garbage. I opened my laptop. The blue light cast a cold shadow across my desk. If I was officially out of the family, then my wallet was out of the family too. I logged into my primary wealth management portal. My fingers moved across the keyboard with absolute certainty. First, I opened the real estate ledger. There it was, the automatic monthly transfer for their sprawling Connecticut mansion. $6,000 scheduled to be withdrawn in just 2 days. I clicked the cancel button. The confirmation screen popped up and I hit accept without hesitation. Next, I navigated to the automotive lease accounts. Preston loved parading around in his luxury Mercedes, acting like an actual wealthy millionaire. Jasmine used her custom Range Rover as a prop for her social media videos, pretending her husband bought it for her as a push present for a baby they did not even have yet. I selected both vehicle accounts. Cancel. Cancel. Another $2,500 a month vanished from their future. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. I felt no guilt, only a profound sense of liberation. I pulled up the corporate health insurance portal. They had been riding on my premium executive health plan for years, enjoying zero deductibles and luxury care. I removed Patricia, Richard, Preston, and Jasmine from my dependents list. The system warned me that this action could not be undone. I confirmed the removal. Finally, I accessed the family cellular plan. 4 unlimited data lines fully paid by me, so Jasmine could stream her influencer content all day long. I terminated every single line except my own. In the span of 10 minutes, I had systematically wiped out $15,000 in monthly family expenses. I closed the laptop, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, and looked out at the Chicago skyline. They had wanted to hurt me, to make me feel small and isolated right before the holidays. Instead, they had handed me the exact excuse I needed to cut the heavy financial chains that had been dragging me down for years. I took a slow sip of the wine, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. The silence in my apartment was beautiful. I took a hot shower, washed my face, and climbed into bed. I fully expected to sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. I pulled the heavy duvet over my shoulders and closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day finally catch up with me. But the sweet peace did not last long. At exactly 1:30 in the morning, the silence was shattered. My phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand, the buzzing sound loud and jarring in the dark room. I groaned, reaching blindly for the device. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom, blinding me momentarily. It was an incoming call from Patricia. I watched it ring loudly, completely refusing to answer it. As soon as it went to voicemail, the phone buzzed again. A text message flashed across the locked screen entirely in capital letters. "Why is my platinum card declining at the Bellagio front desk? Fix this problem right now." I ignored the frantic text message from my mother, silenced my phone entirely, and drifted into the most peaceful sleep I had experienced in 4 years. The next morning, the crisp Chicago air matched my mood perfectly. I dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, grabbed my coffee, and walked into the sleek glass and marble lobby of my financial firm at exactly 8:45. I was standing at the front reception desk speaking with our head of security about the morning meeting schedule when the heavy glass revolving doors violently swung open. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Preston marched through the entrance. His face was flushed with unhinged rage, and he was wearing a custom designer suit that I had paid for just 2 months ago. Right behind him was his wife, Jasmine. She held her smartphone high on a portable gimbal, a bright ring light illuminating her perfectly contoured face. She was already crying, wiping away invisible tears with her manicured fingers as she spoke directly to her 500,000 followers on a live broadcast. "You guys, I am literally shaking right now." Jasmine sobbed into her camera, panning the lens around the opulent corporate lobby to show her audience exactly where she was. "I am standing inside the firm where my cruel corporate sister-in-law works, the woman who just financially abused me and my unborn baby. We woke up this morning and found out she froze our accounts right before the holidays. Who does that to a pregnant woman?" She angled the camera to catch me standing behind the reception desk, zooming in on my face. Preston did not wait for his wife to finish her theatrical performance. He crossed the lobby in wide, aggressive strides and slammed his hands down hard on the marble counter. He leaned in close, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he always did when we were kids. "You have exactly 5 seconds to log into your computer and reactivate those cards." "Stella," he growled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and drawing stares from the arriving executives. "Mom was stranded at the Bellagio front desk for 2 hours this morning. Her card declined in front of everyone. They threatened to call the police on her. Turn the accounts back on right now." 2 of our building security guards immediately stepped forward, their hands resting near their radios ready to intervene. I raised a single hand, signaling them to wait. I did not step back. I looked up at my brother, taking in his bloodshot eyes and the sheer panic hiding just beneath his aggression. "The accounts are closed, Preston," I said, my voice completely level and calm. "They are not frozen. They are terminated. I am no longer part of the family, remember? Patricia made that incredibly clear in the group chat last night. I am simply respecting her wishes. Do not play games with me." Preston snapped his face inches from the protective glass partition. "You cannot just cut us off. We have expenses. We have a lifestyle to maintain. You have a duty to this family." "A duty?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call draining $15,000 a month from my bank account so you can pretend to be a successful entrepreneur?" Preston scoffed loudly, standing up straight and gesturing to the expensive lobby around us. "You owe me, Stella. Do not act like you got here all by yourself. I am the one who introduced you to your first boss in this industry. Without my connections, you would be nothing." I felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. He had just handed me the perfect opening, and I was not going to miss it. "You mean the boss who fired me?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. Jasmine stopped talking to her stream, her camera still pointed at us, capturing every word. Yes, Preston let us talk about that amazing connection. I continued, my tone surgical and precise. You mean the boss who fired me because you came into my office, stole blank company checks from my desk drawer, and forged my signature to pay off your illegal sports betting debt? Preston's face lost all its color instantly. He swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Jasmine's phone, suddenly very aware that thousands of strangers were watching this unfold live. Shut up, Stella, he hissed through his teeth. But I was not going to shut up, not anymore. I paid $10,000 out of my own pocket to cover what you stole, I said, making sure every syllable was crisp and clear. I paid that money to keep the firm from pressing felony fraud charges against you. I kept you out of federal prison, Preston. And I ate ramen noodles in a freezing apartment for an entire year to make up for the savings you stole from me. I do not owe you a single dime. You owe me your freedom. Jasmine quickly turned the camera back to herself, her eyes wide with panic as her chat section likely exploded with questions about her husband's criminal past. She tried to salvage the situation instantly, reverting to her victim persona. Do not listen to her, Jasmine told her followers, her voice shaking with manufactured outrage. She is lying to cover up her own greed. She hates that I am pregnant. She hates that Preston and I are happy. Jasmine stormed up to the desk, standing shoulder to shoulder with Preston. She dug into her designer handbag and pulled out the keys to the luxury SUV I had been leasing for her. She shook the keys aggressively in my direction, the heavy metal jingling loudly in the quiet lobby. You are a bitter, lonely woman, Stella. Jasmine spat, glaring at me with absolute disgust. We do not need your money. Preston is closing a massive funding round for his startup next week. We are leaving. And you are officially dead to us. I looked at the keys in her hand, then looked up at her perfectly contoured face. I smiled coldly, feeling a deep, satisfying calm wash over me. You might want to check the street, Jasmine, I said softly, because those keys are completely useless now. Jasmine frowned, her fake outrage replaced by genuine confusion. She turned around, following my gaze through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the lobby that looked out onto the busy Chicago street. Preston turned too. Parked illegally in the loading zone was Jasmine's pristine white Range Rover, and backing up directly toward its front bumper with its yellow lights flashing brightly was a heavy-duty city tow truck. Jasmine shoves violently past the heavy glass doors of the lobby, her designer stiletto heels clicking frantically against the cold concrete of the sidewalk. She holds her smartphone high on its gimbal, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She screams directly into the camera lens, broadcasting to her 500,000 followers that she is actively being victimized in the streets of Chicago. Preston follows right behind her, his face twisted in raw, unhinged rage. He bypasses his weeping wife and charges straight for the tow truck driver. The driver, a burly man in a neon safety vest, is calmly securing the heavy steel chains around the rear wheels of Jasmine's gleaming white Range Rover. Preston grabs the man by the shoulder, yanking him backward and demanding he drop the hydraulic lift immediately. The driver shoves Preston away with a heavy hand, warning the furious man to back off before things get physical. Jasmine is sobbing loudly now, narrating to her viewers that her evil corporate sister-in-law is stealing her vehicle right out from under her vulnerable pregnant body. The wail of a police siren cuts through the morning traffic. A Chicago Police Department cruiser pulls sharply to the curb, its lights flashing brightly against the overcast sky. Two officers step out, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They order everyone to step back from the tow truck. Preston immediately points a shaking finger at the driver, shouting that this man is attempting to steal his wife's luxury car and demanding he be arrested. Stella pushes through the lobby doors and walks calmly into the crisp morning air. She adjusts her tailored blazer and approaches the lead police officer, handing him a thick, crisp manila folder. She explains in a clear, authoritative voice that there is absolutely no theft occurring here. She states she is the sole legal lessee of the vehicle in question. The officer opens the folder. Stella has provided the original dealership contracts, the financing agreements, and the current insurance policies. Every single document is printed with Stella's name and her corporate address. Stella informs the officer that the individuals screaming on the sidewalk have been operating the vehicle without her authorization for months, and she has legally ordered the repossession company to retrieve her property. The police officer carefully reviews the notarized paperwork, nods his head, and turns his attention back to Preston. He orders Preston to step away from the tow truck immediately or face instant arrest for disturbing the peace and threatening a licensed city contractor. Preston stands completely frozen on the pavement. His jaw clenches so tightly a muscle jumps in his cheek. The hydraulic lift whines loudly and the pristine Range Rover is hoisted up into the air. Jasmine wails into her phone camera, watching her ultimate social media status symbol get hauled down the busy avenue. Before Preston can formulate another argument, a black Uber SUV abruptly pulls into the loading zone right behind the police cruiser. The rear doors fly open before the vehicle even comes to a complete halt. Patricia and Richard storm out onto the sidewalk. Patricia is dressed in her typical expensive country club attire, her face flushed red with absolute fury. She ignores the police, ignores her sobbing daughter-in-law, and zeroes in completely on Stella. Patricia marches straight up to her daughter, raises her right hand, and delivers a blinding full-force slap across Stella's left cheek. The sharp crack echoes over the ambient street noise, causing pedestrians to stop and stare. The two police officers instantly step forward, shouting for Patricia to back down and keep her hands to herself. Stella raises a calm hand, signaling the officers to wait. She does not flinch. She does not reach up to rub her stinging red cheek. She simply stares down at the woman who raised her, her expression completely unreadable. Patricia points a shaking manicured finger directly at Stella's face. "You vindictive, ungrateful little monster!" Patricia screams, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You are trying to humiliate us in public. You are destroying this family's pristine reputation over a petty temper tantrum. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. By stranding your own mother at a luxury hotel and stealing your brother's car on the street, you are dead to me." Stella looks at her mother with eyes like ice. She replies with a dangerously low voice, stating that a reputation built entirely on someone else's wallet is not a reputation at all. It is just a well-funded, pathetic lie. Richard steps forward, puffing his chest out in a desperate attempt to look intimidating. He pulls his frantic wife back by the arm, sneering at Stella with a deeply misplaced sense of arrogance. He tells Stella that she has just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. He says she thinks she holds all the power in the family just because she pays a few bills, but her reign of financial terror is officially over. Richard laughs, a harsh and grating sound that lacks any real humor. "You think you are so smart, cutting off the cars and canceling the credit cards?" Richard says, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think we actually need you. You just wait. The bank just approved the $1.5 million loan on the family house this morning. The funds are clearing into Preston's business account as we speak. We do not need your pennies anymore, Stella. We have real capital now." Stella stands perfectly still on the cold pavement. The sounds of the traffic and Jasmine's continued sobbing seem to fade away completely. Her heart drops violently into her stomach. Her blood runs entirely cold. She stares at her father's smug face, processing the impossible, terrifying words he just spoke aloud. She paid off the heavy mortgage on that Connecticut mansion 3 years ago. The property deed is sitting securely in a blind LLC that she controls completely. There is absolutely no way her parents could legally secure a $1.5 million commercial loan against that property. The only way the bank would have ever approved a home equity loan of that massive magnitude is if the true property owner signed the authorization papers. Stella never signed off on a home equity loan. I did not waste another second looking at my father. I turned and walked briskly away from the chaotic scene on the sidewalk. Behind me, Jasmine was still screaming at the tow truck driver, but her voice faded into the ambient city traffic. I hailed a taxi to my office building and slid into the back seat. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. If Richard was telling the truth about a $1.5 million loan, my parents had just crossed the line into severe felony fraud. I marched through the lobby of my firm, flashing my badge at the security desk, and took the private elevator up to my floor. I locked my office door and sat down at my desk. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Working as a wealth management director meant I had access to powerful financial tracking software. Pulling credit histories without explicit client authorization was a fireable offense. But as I stared at the blank search field, I knew I had absolutely no choice. I needed to know exactly how deep the knife was buried. I typed in my own social security number first. The system processed the request, cross-referencing global banking databases. A few seconds later, my detailed credit profile loaded onto the screen. I scrolled past my pristine payment history, my mortgage, and my standard credit lines. Then I saw it. A massive red flag sitting right at the top of my recent inquiries. A massive commercial business loan had just been approved. The total amount was $1.5 million. My stomach plummeted as I clicked on the origin documents. The loan was registered to a newly formed limited liability company. A quick corporate registry search revealed the nature of the business. It was a cryptocurrency mining operation. Preston had been talking about starting a crypto farm for a year, begging everyone for seed money. I pulled up the master loan agreement. My eyes scanned the guarantor section. There were 3 names listed: Richard, Patricia, and myself. I zoomed in closely on the signature line. There was my name signed in blue ink. It was a remarkably good forgery. Preston must have traced it from old tax returns I had left at their house years ago. But the most damning detail was the notary stamp sitting right next to the forged signature. My mother had notarized the fraudulent document, legally certifying that I had signed it in her presence. They had weaponized my immaculate credit score to secure a massive commercial loan for a fake business. I dialed my mother. She answered on the second ring. I could hear a car engine in the background. "Are you calling to apologize?" Patricia asked. Her voice was dripping with smug satisfaction. "Because if you think you can just turn our cars off and get away with it, you are sorely mistaken." I ignored her bait. "I am looking at the commercial loan agreement you filed," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You forged my signature, Mom. You used my social security number to secure $1.5 million for Preston. You committed federal mortgage fraud and identity theft." Patricia did not sound panicked. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Stella. You are a millionaire. Your brother needed capital to finally get his business off the ground. He is going to make it big this time, and then he will pay the loan back. You will not even notice the money is tied up." I gripped the edge of my desk. "You committed a felony," I said. "You notarized a forged document." Patricia sighed loudly. "I notarized it myself to save time," she said smoothly. "Listen to me very carefully, Stella. If you report this to the bank or the police, you will be sending your own flesh and blood to federal prison. You will put your father and your brother behind bars for years. Is that what you really want? Destroying your own family over some silly paperwork?" The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She genuinely believed that our shared DNA made them completely immune to the law. She thought she could hold my conscience hostage. She assumed I would simply absorb a massive fraudulent debt to protect the family reputation, just like I always had. "I am not paying a single cent of Preston's debt," I replied. "You do not have a choice," Patricia snapped, her sweet tone vanishing instantly. "The funds have already cleared. The bank holds the deed to the house as collateral, and your name is on the dotted line. You belong to us, Stella. You always will." She hung up the phone. The dial tone echoed in the quiet office. I took a deep, ragged breath. I had to move faster than they did. I needed to contact my lawyer before Preston transferred the stolen funds into an offshore crypto wallet. I reached for my mouse, preparing to log into my secure banking portal to lock down my identity. Before I could even click on the browser icon, a sharp chime echoed from my computer speakers. A new email notification popped up in the corner of my monitor, marked with a bright red exclamation point. I glanced at the sender. It was from the global director of compliance for my financial firm. The subject line made the blood freeze in my veins. "Urgent. Suspicious activity flagged on your personal accounts linked to a federal investigation." The fraud was not just a family problem anymore. It had already bled into my professional life. My firm monitored all employee credit profiles to ensure strict regulatory compliance. The massive, sudden commercial loan tied to a high-risk cryptocurrency venture had triggered an automatic internal alert. My career, my financial licenses, my professional reputation, and my entire livelihood were now officially on the line. I was running out of time. The phone on my desk rang before I could even process the email. It was Marcus Vance, the Global Director of Compliance. He did not say hello. He simply told me to get to his office immediately. Marcus Vance was a man who ruined careers for a living. His office was a sterile glass-enclosed cube at the center of the executive floor. When I walked in, he did not offer me a seat. He turned his laptop monitor toward me. On the screen was the loan origination document for Preston's crypto mining company, bearing my forged signature and my social security number. $1.5 million, Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. Wired yesterday to a high-risk corporate entity that tripped 3 separate anti-money laundering algorithms this morning. And your name is the primary guarantor. Explain. I kept my posture rigid. I looked him dead in the eye and told him it was a forgery. I explained that my parents and brother had stolen my identity to secure the loan. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. A convenient story, Stella. You are a senior wealth management director. You know exactly how this looks to the federal regulators. It looks like you are funding an illegal offshore crypto washing operation through your relatives to bypass our internal oversight. I would never do that. I fired back, my voice sharp. 3 years ago, I flagged a $50,000 discrepancy in my father's accounts and fired him as a client. I reported the irregularity to your department the very same day. I do not mix family with finance. You know my track record. Marcus stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He knew I was telling the truth, but in the world of federal financial regulations, truth did not matter without hard documentation. The feds are already looking at the wire transfers, Marcus said, his tone devoid of any warmth. I am suspending your trading privileges effective immediately. You have exactly 48 hours to provide my department with ironclad, legally binding proof that you are a victim of identity theft. If you fail, I will permanently revoke your licenses, terminate your employment, and hand your files over to the FBI. Get it done. I walked out of his office with my pulse hammering against my ribs. The reality of the situation crashed down on me. Simply cutting off their credit cards and canceling their car leases was not enough. My family had not just taken my money. They had shackled me to a sinking criminal ship. If I tried to protect them now, I would go to federal prison. If I stayed quiet, I would lose the career I had sacrificed my entire 20s to build. I could not just cut them off anymore. I had to actively destroy them. I marched straight back to my desk and picked up my cell phone. I did not call a standard family attorney. I called Diane Thorne. She was the most ruthless corporate litigator in Chicago, a woman who specialized in financial fraud and asset recovery. I had referred wealthy clients to her in the past, and I knew exactly how vicious she could be in a courtroom. Diane answered on the first ring. I laid out the entire situation. I told her about the forged signature, the fraudulent loan, the fake crypto company, and the notary stamp my mother had illegally applied. I want them crushed, I told Diane, my voice cold and absolute. I want the fraud affidavits filed with the bank by the end of the day. I want the police reports filed for identity theft. I want a civil suit prepared for damages, and I want the federal authorities notified about the wire transfers. Burn it all to the ground. Diane did not hesitate. Consider it done. I will send the preliminary affidavits to your inbox in an hour. I hung up the phone, feeling a renewed sense of control. The legal machine was now in motion, and it was a machine my grifter brother and arrogant parents could never outmaneuver. I sat back in my chair, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I had a mountain of paperwork to compile before the day was over. But before I could even log back into my computer, my personal cell phone began vibrating violently against the mahogany desk. It buzzed once, then twice, then continuously. Notifications flooded the lock screen in a rapid, relentless stream. They were alerts from Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. My name was being tagged hundreds of times a minute. I swiped open my phone and tapped the first notification. It linked directly to Jasmine's TikTok account. She had just posted a new video, and the view count was already climbing past 2 million. The video was masterfully edited for maximum emotional manipulation. Jasmine was sitting on the floor of what looked like an empty nursery. She was wearing an oversized sweater, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes red and puffy. She was sobbing uncontrollably into the camera, clutching a tiny pair of baby shoes against her chest. She rubbed her completely flat stomach as she spoke. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Jasmine cried, her voice trembling perfectly. "My sister-in-law is a millionaire corporate executive, and she hates me. She hates that I am pregnant. Today, without any warning, she illegally seized my car while I was on my way to a high-risk doctor appointment. Now she is trying to freeze all of our bank accounts to force my husband and me out onto the street. She wants to make my unborn baby homeless right before Thanksgiving." The video cut to a slow-motion dramatic clip of the tow truck hauling away her Range Rover overlaid with sad acoustic piano music. The caption read, "Corporate greed is trying to destroy my family. Please help us." I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The comments section was a toxic wasteland of pure hatred directed entirely at me. Strangers were calling for my immediate firing. They were posting my full name, the name of my financial firm, and the corporate address of my building. They were organizing. A loud, rhythmic chanting suddenly interrupted the quiet hum of my office floor. It was muffled at first, but it was growing louder by the second. I stood up and walked over to my expansive corner window looking down at the street 12 floors below. My blood ran cold. The sidewalk outside the main entrance of my building was completely blocked. A massive crowd had already formed, organized with terrifying speed by Jasmine's rabid fan base. They were holding up hastily scrawled cardboard signs with my name painted in bright red letters. The internet had officially turned on me, and the mob was now standing right outside my front door. The muffled chanting from the street below vibrated against the thick glass of my office window. My desk phone was flashing with internal calls, likely building security, asking for directives on how to handle the mob forming on the sidewalk. I did not answer. Instead, I gathered my briefcase and took the private executive elevator down to the secured underground parking garage. I needed to meet Diane Thorne at her firm, and I needed to do it before the angry crowd outside breached the lobby. As the elevator doors parted in the dimly lit garage, a man in a rumpled gray suit stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. My heart spiked, assuming he was one of Jasmine's deranged followers, who had somehow bypassed the security gates. He did not hold a protest sign. He held a thick stack of legal documents. "Are you Stella?" he asked, stepping directly into my path. Before I could confirm or deny, he shoved the heavy stack of papers against my chest. "You have been served," he stated flatly, turning on his heel and disappearing toward the stairwell. I leaned against the hood of my car and opened the manila envelope. The header on the first page made my breath catch in my throat. It was a petition filed in the state court, a petition for temporary conservatorship. My parents had hired a shady bottom-feeding law firm to petition a judge for complete legal control over my life, my finances, and my medical decisions. The affidavit attached to the petition was a masterpiece of fabricated hysteria. Patricia and Richard claimed that my recent actions, terminating family financial support, illegally towing my sister-in-law's car, and acting erratically at my corporate office, were undeniable symptoms of a severe acute mental breakdown. They painted me as a danger to myself and others, requesting that the court instantly strip me of my autonomy and place my assets under their direct control for my own protection. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a missed call from my father, followed immediately by a new voicemail notification. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, locked the doors, and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the quiet cabin of my car. He sounded impossibly smug, entirely convinced that he had just successfully checkmated me. "Hello, Stella," Richard began, his tone dripping with fake paternal concern. "By now you should have received the court summons. Your mother and I are very worried about your mental state. Freezing our accounts, taking Jasmine's car right out from under her, these are not the actions of a sane woman. The judge will absolutely agree with us. We have medical professionals ready to testify that you need to be placed in a psychiatric facility for a mandatory hold." He paused, letting the heavy threat sink in. "But we do not want to do that to you, Stella. We love you. We are your family. So here is how we make this all go away. You are going to sign a legally binding debt acknowledgement for the $1.5 million commercial loan. You are going to formally assume the debt and inform your compliance department that you authorize the transaction. You will restore your mother's credit cards and return Jasmine's vehicle by tonight. You do that and we drop the mental health petition immediately. Do not make us lock you up in a ward, Stella. Be smart. I did not feel fear. I felt a surge of absolute crystalline rage. They were not just trying to steal my money anymore. They were actively trying to strip away my basic human rights, threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to cover up their felony fraud. I started my car, drove out of the secure exit, and headed straight for Diane Thorne's downtown office. 20 minutes later, I threw the conservatorship petition and my phone down on Diane's massive glass desk. She listened to Richard's voicemail with a perfectly neutral expression. When the recording finished, Diane actually smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. Extortion, Diane said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers. Blackmail. Filing a frivolous lawsuit to intimidate a victim of fraud. Your father just handed us the exact leverage we need to bury them. I will have this conservatorship petition thrown out by a judge before lunch tomorrow, and we will add extortion to the criminal complaint. I paced across her office, my mind racing. That solves the conservatorship, I said, turning back to her. But Marcus Vance gave me 48 hours to clear my name at my firm. The federal anti-money laundering algorithms are already flagging the loan. We need to prove they committed fraud to secure that $1.5 million. Diane opened her laptop. To secure a commercial loan of that massive size for a startup with zero revenue, the bank required hard collateral. She explained, her fingers flying across the keys. They used the Connecticut mansion. The loan documents show they leveraged the equity in the family estate. I shook my head. That is impossible. 3 years ago, when Preston nearly bankrupted them, I stepped in and bailed them out. I paid off the massive arrears on their mortgage to save the house from foreclosure. I restructured their entire financial portfolio. Diane nodded, her eyes glued to the screen as she pulled up the state property records database. Exactly. You paid it. But the bank still processed a new loan against the property deed this week. They must have claimed the house was free and clear. Let me pull the exact deed transfer documents from 2019 when you intervened. I walked around the desk and stood behind Diane, staring at the complex legal documents scrolling across her monitor. We needed to find the exact mechanism they used to pledge the house as collateral without my knowledge. If they forged my signature on the loan, they must have forged something on the property deed as well. Diane downloaded the 2019 deed of trust and the current 2026 loan collateral annex. She placed the two digital documents side by side on her massive monitor. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes darting back and forth between the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. For a full minute, the office was completely silent. Then Diane let out a sharp gasp. She covered her mouth with her hand and suddenly she started laughing. It was not a polite professional chuckle. It was a deep, unrestrained laugh of pure disbelief. I stared at her, completely confused. Diane, what is it? What did you find? Diane shook her head, still laughing, as she pointed a manicured finger at the screen. Stella, your parents are complete idiots. She breathed out, her eyes shining with absolute legal victory. They were so desperate to get their hands on that crypto money, they did not even bother to read the actual property records they submitted to the bank. Look at the deed transfer from 2019. Look closely at the ownership clause. I leaned down, squinting at the highlighted section of the document. My eyes scanned the legal text, absorbing the specific details of the transaction I had executed 3 years ago to save them from ruin. My breath hitched in my throat. My blood ran completely cold, and then a slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. I stared at the glowing monitor on Diane's desk, tracing the lines of dense legal text with my index finger. There it was, printed in stark black and white. The property owner of the sprawling Connecticut estate was listed as Harbor View Holdings. Not Richard. Not Patricia. My Blind, LLC. Diane spun her leather executive chair around to face me. Her eyes were gleaming with the unmistakable thrill of a corporate slaughter. They do not own the house, Stella Diane said, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp cadence. They have not owned that property for 3 years. When you bailed them out of bankruptcy, you did not just pay off their massive arrears. You executed a complete transfer of the property deed into your corporate entity. Your parents are not homeowners. Legally speaking, they are month-to-month tenants. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. A sharp, genuine laugh escaped my chest as the memory washed over me. It was a rainy Tuesday in October 2019. Richard was drowning in toxic commercial real estate investments, and the bank was threatening immediate foreclosure on their precious mansion. Patricia had called me sobbing hysterically that she could not bear the social humiliation of losing her country club address and having her friends see moving trucks on their lawn. I drove straight to their house with a thick stack of legal documents and a cashier's check that drained nearly all of my early investment profits. I sat across the vast marble kitchen island from my mother. I handed her a pen and told her clearly that if I was going to wipe out their massive debt, I required total financial protection. Patricia did not even read the first paragraph. She was entirely absorbed in a glossy Neiman Marcus holiday catalog, complaining loudly about how boring and depressing legal paperwork was. She sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as she flipped through pages of designer handbags. She signed her name on every single dotted line I pointed to, completely oblivious to the fine print that permanently stripped her of her ownership rights. She handed the pen back, flipped another page in her catalog, and told me to make sure the landscaping bill was also paid on my way out. From that exact moment forward, my parents had absolutely no legal claim to the property. Diane tapped her manicured nail against the computer screen, pulling me back to the present. This completely changes the game, Stella Diane said, her tone dead serious. To secure a $1.5 million commercial loan, Richard and Patricia pledged the Connecticut estate as hard collateral. They signed federal banking documents swearing under penalty of perjury that they held the title free and clear. They pledged an asset they do not own, I said, the reality solidifying in my mind. Exactly, Diane confirmed, leaning forward over her desk. It is textbook mortgage fraud. And because the loan was issued across state lines to fund Preston's fake cryptocurrency startup, it falls directly under federal jurisdiction. The moment the bank discovers the collateral is invalid, their automated risk systems will trigger an immediate default. The entire loan amount will be recalled instantly. But Preston already transferred the funds to a corporate account, I added, pulling up the wire transfer logs on my phone. Diane smiled her ruthless shark-like smile. Which means when the bank comes calling for their money this afternoon, Preston will not be able to return it. The bank will automatically file a criminal complaint for fraud. Your parents and your brother just handed themselves federal indictments on a silver platter. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought a fabricated psychiatric hold and a fake conservatorship threat would force me to absorb their debts and cower in fear. Instead, they had just handed me the match to burn their entire fake empire to the ash. I need you to contact the bank's fraud department immediately, I told Diane, my voice ringing with absolute authority. Send them the original 2019 deed transfer. Provide the proof that my signature on the loan documents was forged. Let the bank's internal compliance team trigger the default. I want their accounts frozen by tomorrow morning. I want the compliance director at my firm to receive the bank's official fraud confirmation before my 48-hour window expires. Consider it done, Diane said, her fingers already flying across her keyboard to draft the emergency injunction. I will have the federal fraud affidavits filed before the close of business. But what about the house? They are still living in your property. I am dealing with the house right now, I replied. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I did not need Diane to handle this specific piece of the puzzle. I wanted the deep personal satisfaction of doing it myself. I opened a blank legal template and began typing rapidly. I filled out the property address, the names of the current occupants, and the specific property statutes for the state of Connecticut. It was a formal, legally binding 3-day notice to quit, an eviction notice. I cited unauthorized commercial use of the property and the commission of a felony on the premises. They had exactly 72 hours to pack up their designer clothes, their fake status symbols, and vacate my house. If they refused, I would have the county sheriff physically remove them from the property. I hit print, listening to the satisfying hum of Diane's laser printer, spitting out the ultimate consequence of my parents' endless greed. I gathered the freshly printed pages and slid them into a crisp manila envelope. I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline. I was going to drive straight to Connecticut and hand this notice directly to Richard. I was going to watch his smug arrogance shatter into a million pieces. But as I reached for the heavy glass door handle to leave Diane's office, my personal cell phone let out a piercing, high-pitched alarm. It was not a text message or a social media tag. The screen flashed bright red with an emergency notification from my apartment's smart security system. The alert spelled out a terrifying reality. Someone had just physically bypassed the electronic keypad on my front door. The lock was completely compromised, and an unauthorized entry was currently in progress inside my home. I shoved the eviction notice back into my briefcase and sprinted for the garage elevator. Diane shouted something behind me, but the heavy glass door had already swung shut. My mind was entirely consumed by the flashing red alert on my phone screen. The drive from downtown to my apartment was a blur of aggressive lane changes and blaring horns. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My apartment was a high-security building with a biometric lock system. A random burglar would not target my unit in the middle of the day. This was deliberate. This was targeted. And I knew exactly who it was, Preston. It had to be him. He was the one desperate enough to break in. He knew that working as a senior wealth management director meant I kept physical backups of my most sensitive financial ledgers and personal asset declarations in a fireproof safe at home. He also knew that if I still possessed the original wet ink copies of the 2019 deed transfer, his entire $1.5 million house of cards would instantly disintegrate. He was trying to destroy the evidence before I could present it to the federal regulators. I threw my car into park the second I cleared the resident gates. I bypassed the lobby concierge and took the service stairs 2 at a time. When I reached my floor, the hallway was completely silent. I approached my door. The heavy steel frame was unblemished, but the digital keypad panel hung loosely by a wire. Preston had always been adept at bypassing basic electronics, a skill he loved to brag about when he first started building his illegal crypto mining rigs. I gently pushed the door open. It swung inward with a faint creak. My apartment, my immaculate, carefully curated sanctuary, had been entirely desecrated. The entryway console table was overturned. The living room cushions were slashed and tossed across the hardwood floor. Framed photographs were shattered. But the distinct sound of tearing paper and crashing plastic was coming from down the hall. I moved silently toward my home office, my adrenaline surging. I did not call out. I did not reach for my phone to dial the police. A cold, hyper-focused calculation had completely taken over my brain. I needed to see exactly what he was doing. I stepped into the doorway of the office. Preston was frantically tearing through the contents of my filing cabinets. His shirt was soaked in sweat. His eyes were wide and manic. My heavy, fireproof lockbox sat on the center of my desk, its hinges violently pried apart by the steel crowbar currently resting on my chair. He was snatching up thumb drives and tossing them onto the floor, stomping on the plastic casings with the heel of his heavy boots. Mounds of shredded bank statements and tax returns covered the carpet like snow. "Are you looking for the 2019 deed transfer?" I asked, my voice ringing out sharp and clear in the confined space. Preston spun around, dropping a fistful of folders. He staggered backward, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. For a fraction of a second, he looked like a terrified child caught stealing from a cookie jar. Then his eyes locked onto mine and the fear vanished. It was instantly replaced by a toxic defensive rage. He kicked a pile of shredded documents out of his way and took a heavy step toward me. He was 6 feet 2 inches of pure, unearned arrogance. He deliberately closed the distance between us, using his height and sheer physical mass to trap me in the doorway. He wanted me to cower. He wanted me to shrink back and surrender control, just like our parents had conditioned me to do my entire life. But I did not move a single inch. I held my ground, staring up at his red, flushed face. "You really think you are so smart?" Preston sneered. his breath reeking of stale coffee and panic. "You think you can just shut off our accounts and leave us out to dry? We are your family, Stella. We made you who you are." "You made me a target for federal investigators," I replied, keeping my tone completely even. "You broke into my home. You destroyed my property." Preston laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the ruined walls. He stepped even closer until I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from mine, entirely shifting his tactics from physical intimidation to psychological warfare. He knew exactly where to strike to inflict the maximum amount of emotional damage. "You're just a sad, lonely spinster, Stella." Preston spat, his voice dropping into a cruel, mocking whisper. "Mom was right. No one will ever love you because you care more about spreadsheets than blood." His words hung in the stale air of the ruined office. A year ago, that exact insult would have devastated me. It would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. I would have capitulated, opened my checkbook, and begged for their toxic version of affection. But standing amidst the wreckage of my home, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical precision. I realized instantly that Preston's massive, fragile ego was his greatest vulnerability. He needed to feel dominant. He needed to believe he had thoroughly outsmarted his rigid corporate sister. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I allowed my shoulders to slump. I broke eye contact, looking down at the destroyed hard drives on the floor. I let my voice waver perfectly, feigning a defeated, desperate tone. "You really think you can get away with forging my signature on a federal bank loan, Preston?" I asked, letting my voice sound small and broken. Preston's chest puffed out. A triumphant, predatory smile stretched across his face. He had taken the bait, effortlessly intoxicated by his own perceived victory. "I already did," Preston scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "The bank approved it. Mom notarized it. It's your word against three of ours. You're going to pay my debt, little sister." He let out another arrogant chuckle, entirely convinced he had won the war. I slowly raised my head. The feigned defeat vanished from my posture. I stood up perfectly straight, a genuine chilling smile forming on my lips. I did not look at Preston. Instead, I shifted my gaze just over his right shoulder. Sitting on the top shelf of the bookcase behind him, perfectly disguised within the binding of a decorative vintage dictionary, was a tiny blinking red light. Because I frequently handled millions of dollars in corporate assets from my home office, my compliance department required extreme security measures. It was a high-definition motion, activated nannycam wired directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. I had the full, unedited confession on tape. I did not wait for Preston to leave the building before I moved. As soon as he stormed out of my ruined office, completely convinced he had just checkmated me, I locked the heavy wooden door behind him. I walked straight to the vintage dictionary on my bookshelf and extracted the hidden memory card with surgical precision. My hands were perfectly steady. I downloaded the pristine 4K resolution video file directly onto a secure encrypted hard drive. I added the forged commercial loan documents, Diane's property deed transfer records, and the bank default alerts that proved the massive financial deception. There was no hesitation left in my system. My brother had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. I bypassed my demolished living room, stepping carefully over the slashed sofa cushions and shattered picture frames, and walked out the front door. I drove straight downtown to the Federal Plaza building. The local FBI field office, specializing in white-collar crime, operated out of the highly secured 17th floor. Thanks to my executive position in wealth management, I knew exactly which regulatory channels to navigate and exactly who to ask for. Special Agent Thomas Carter sat across from me in a stark, windowless interview room. The metal table between us was bare, except for my silver hard drive. Carter was a veteran investigator with sharp, tired eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had seen every variation of corporate greed, but watching a senior wealth director walk in to voluntarily surrender her entire family was clearly a first. I sat in perfect silence as he plugged the drive into his secure terminal and opened the files. Carter read through the fraudulent $1.5 million loan application. He scrutinized my mother's illegal notary stamp, comparing it against the state registry databases. Then he clicked on the video file. Preston's arrogant, mocking voice filled the small room, echoing sharply off the cinderblock walls. I already did. The bank approved it. Mom notarized it. It is your word against three of ours. You are going to pay my debt, little sister. While Carter watched my brother's smug face on the high-definition screen, my mind drifted back to a sweltering summer afternoon when I was 10 years old. I had fallen off the roof of my father's meticulously manicured pool house and snapped my forearm. The bone was visibly protruding against my skin, throbbing with a sickening heat. I had dragged myself into the living room, crying in absolute agony, begging my mother to call an ambulance. Patricia had barely glanced up from her fashion magazine. She told me to stop screaming because Preston was in the middle of a crucial level on his video game, and my crying was ruining his concentration. I sat on the cold kitchen tile floor for 2 excruciating hours, cradling my broken arm against my chest, waiting for my brother to defeat a digital boss before I was deemed worthy of basic medical attention. That was the exact day I learned what my family truly valued. The loyalty did not die today. It died a long time ago on that kitchen floor. Special Agent Carter paused the video. He folded his hands over his keyboard and looked at me with a heavy, profoundly serious expression. He did not sugarcoat the reality of the situation. Stella Carter began, his voice gravelly and direct. We have clear, irrefutable evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud across state lines. This is not a civil dispute. If we move forward with this, it triggers a federal grand jury. Your brother is looking at 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Your parents are looking at 5 years minimum for conspiracy and notary fraud. There is no unwinding this once I log it into the federal system. They will lose everything. He leaned forward, searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of familial guilt that might cause me to recant my testimony later. Are you prepared to send your family to prison? I did not blink. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the absolute truth. They aren't my family, I said, my voice like crushed ice. They're a criminal syndicate. File the charges. File the... Carter held my gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. He tapped a sequence of keys on his terminal, officially transferring my files into the federal database. The evidence is ironclad, he confirmed, closing the file windows. But federal judges move at their own pace. We have to cross-reference the wire transfers, lock down the offshore crypto wallets, and secure the bank subpoenas before we can execute the arrests. We cannot risk them fleeing jurisdiction. He checked his watch and let out a heavy breath. I need 48 hours to secure the federal warrants, Stella. We will move in on Friday morning. Keep your head down until then. Play along if you have to. Do not confront them. Do not let them know we are coming. I stood up, shaking his hand with a firm grip, and walked out of the Federal Plaza building. As I stepped into the crisp autumn air, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I pulled out my phone and checked my calendar. 48 hours meant the warrants would go live on Friday morning. But tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving Day. My parents were hosting their grand annual Thanksgiving dinner at the Connecticut estate. It was Patricia's favorite event of the year. They had invited dozens of their wealthy country club friends, local politicians, and influential business partners to show off their flawless, fabricated lives. They expected me to show up broken and defeated by their conservatorship threat, ready to sign my financial life away to quietly cover their massive debts in the name of family unity. I was definitely going to attend dinner. But I was not bringing a side dish. I was bringing the 3-day eviction notice, and I was going to serve it right before the FBI served their warrants. The sun rose over the city, casting a cold, sharp light into my living room. I stepped over the slashed cushions and shattered glass, entirely ignoring the physical wreckage Preston had left behind the day before. I had spent the night sleeping soundly in my guest room, completely unbothered by the destruction of my property. They could break my things, but they could no longer break my mind. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, vibrating violently against the marble surface. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Patricia. I stared at the glowing screen, letting it ring 4 distinct times before I finally pressed accept. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted her to realize she was no longer in control of my time or my attention. Stella, darling. Patricia's voice oozed through the speaker coated in a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured warmth. Happy Thanksgiving. I know we have had our silly little disagreements lately, but it is a holiday. Family needs to be together. I said nothing, letting her fill the dead air. I could hear the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of expensive caterers in the background at the Connecticut estate. The bank has been terribly unreasonable this morning. Patricia continued, her tone tightening just a fraction as her forced patience wore thin. Preston's accounts are temporarily locked due to some ridiculous clerical error, and they even sent a tow truck for his sports car right out of the driveway. Such an embarrassing overreaction for the neighbors to see. But we are willing to let the whole car incident slide. Just come home for dinner. Bring a $50,000 cashier's check to hold over the bank until Tuesday, and we will completely forgive you for the inconvenience. The sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. They were facing federal indictment for mortgage fraud. Preston was caught on a high-definition security camera breaking into my home, and her solution was to extort another $50,000 from me under the guise of holiday forgiveness. I will not be bringing a check, Patricia, I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I will not be bailing Preston out, and I do not need your forgiveness for a bank freezing assets they legally own. The silence on the line was instantaneous and heavy. When Patricia spoke next, the sugary facade completely evaporated. Her mask slipped and her voice dropped into a vicious, cornered hiss. If you do not show up with the money, we are going to ruin you, Patricia snarled. You think you can just cut us off and walk away without consequences? Jasmine has an exclusive interview scheduled with a major lifestyle magazine tonight during our dinner. She is going to look right into the camera and tell the world that the extreme emotional stress you caused her by harassing Preston made her miscarry her baby. We will destroy your corporate reputation. Your wealth management firm will fire you by Monday morning when the article goes live. My stomach turned a wave of pure, unfiltered disgust washing over me. Jasmine was Preston's glamorous, vapid fiancée, a woman who spent her days posting highly edited luxury shopping hauls on social media, funded entirely by Preston's fraudulent crypto loans. Last month, Jasmine had posted a tearful, dramatic announcement about her pregnancy, complete with a grainy ultrasound photo that garnered thousands of sympathetic likes. Now they were willing to weaponize a fabricated tragedy to blackmail me. It was a new low even for a family built on deception. Go ahead, I said, keeping my tone dead and completely unbothered. Let her do the interview. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. The threat was vile, but it was also remarkably sloppy. My parents were amateur grifters playing a high-stakes game, assuming I would panic at the threat of a public scandal. But in my line of work, dealing with ultra-high-net-worth clients and massive corporate mergers, I routinely utilized top-tier private investigators to run deep background checks before finalizing any asset transfers. I did not panic. I opened my laptop and typed out a highly confidential request to Marcus, a former federal intelligence officer who ran the premier corporate espionage firm in the city. I attached the link to Jasmine's social media ultrasound post and requested a full expedited background check on her medical history, authorizing a premium emergency fee for immediate results. I had a few hours to kill before I needed to leave for the Connecticut estate. I spent the time preparing for absolute war. I showered, washing away the lingering dust of Preston's break-in. I dressed in a pristine, tailored black suit that cost more than my mother's entire catering budget for the evening. I wanted to look exactly like the corporate executioner I was about to become. I carefully placed the federal banking default alerts, the flash drive containing Preston's recorded confession, and the freshly printed 3-day eviction notice into a crisp leather portfolio. The trap was set perfectly. The federal agents would arrive tomorrow morning at dawn, but tonight I was going to serve the appetizer. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my laptop chimed with an incoming encrypted email. It was from Marcus. I opened the file, my eyes rapidly scanning the heavily redacted intelligence report. A sharp, cold laugh erupted from my chest as I read the final paragraph. Patricia and Preston had tried to back me into a corner with a devastating public scandal. but they had fundamentally underestimated my resources. The private investigator had run a reverse digital forensic scan on the ultrasound Jasmine had posted on her Instagram. The image did not belong to her. It was a stolen stock photo lifted from a parenting blog belonging to a random girl in Ohio from 2021. But the medical background check Marcus had managed to pull through his discreet channels was the actual killing blow. Jasmine was not pregnant. She could not possibly be pregnant. According to the surgical records obtained through a routine insurance audit, Jasmine isn't pregnant. She had her tubes tied 3 years ago. The iron gates of the Harbor View estate stood wide open, welcoming a steady stream of luxury vehicles into the sweeping circular driveway. The crisp Connecticut autumn air was entirely masked by the overwhelming scent of roasted turkey, expensive sage stuffing, and the cloying floral arrangements my mother insisted on importing for every major holiday. Valets in immaculate maroon uniforms sprinted frantically back and forth, scrambling to accommodate the influx of high society guests. I sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, watching the sickeningly perfect spectacle unfold through the tinted glass. I smoothed the lapels of my bespoke charcoal gray power suit. It was a sharp structural garment designed for corporate warfare, a stark contrast to the soft cashmere and festive silks waiting inside the house. I did not come to celebrate, I came to execute a demolition. I stepped out of the vehicle, my heels crunching loudly against the gravel. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side were 2 private security contractors I had hired from an elite corporate risk management firm. They were built like brick walls, radiating a silent, highly trained menace. Walking directly behind them was a wiry, unassuming man wearing a beige trench coat. He was a licensed process server, and his hands tightly gripped a thick, crisp manila envelope containing the 3-day eviction notice. We completely bypassed the frantic valet line and marched up the grand brick steps. The heavy double oak doors were propped open to accommodate the massive guest list. I walked straight into the grand foyer. The sprawling mansion was packed with exactly 60 people. I recognized local politicians, influential real estate developers, and a handful of wealthy country club socialites my parents relentlessly courted. A string quartet played a soft classical melody in the corner of the dining room. Waiters in black vests circulated through the crowd, offering champagne flutes and silver trays of meticulously crafted appetizers. It was the absolute pinnacle of Patricia and Richard's fabricated, fraudulent empire. I ignored the sea of wealthy networking and turned my attention toward the sunken living room. The heavy mahogany furniture had been pushed back to create a makeshift, brightly lit stage. A towering professional ring light glared harshly against the warm, ambient lighting of the estate. Jasmine sat in the center of the display on a plush velvet ottoman. She was dressed in a somber, muted gray dress, a sharp departure from her usual flashy designer labels. She was actively dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, perfecting her role as the tragically victimized, grieving mother. A reporter from a prominent regional lifestyle magazine sat opposite her, a digital recorder resting on the coffee table between them. Preston hovered nearby, resting a heavy hand on Jasmine's shoulder, playing the part of the stoic, supportive partner, weathering an unimaginable loss. I took a deep breath, aligning my posture into a rigid, unyielding stance. I walked down the 3 marble steps into the living room. My stilettos clicked sharply against the polished stone floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise like a gunshot. The string quartet in the far corner faltered, a violinist dragging his bow harshly across the strings before stopping entirely. One by one, the 60 high society guests turned their heads. The low hum of wealthy gossip and holiday cheer died instantly. The silence that swept over the room was absolute, suffocating, and terrifyingly heavy. Patricia was standing near the massive stone fireplace holding a silver platter of prosciutto-wrapped asparagus, eagerly entertaining the town mayor. When her eyes locked onto mine, the color completely drained from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands went slack. The heavy silver tray slipped from her grasp and hit the marble hearth with a deafening crash. Crystal shattered. Expensive appetizers splattered across the priceless Persian rug. She did not even blink, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated horror. Richard shoved his way through a cluster of local politicians. His face was a violent, pulsing shade of crimson, the veins in his neck strained against his starched white collar. He lunged toward me, completely abandoning his carefully cultivated image of a refined gentleman. His hand reached out to grab my shoulder. "Get out!" Richard hissed, his voice a venomous, desperate whisper meant to evade the guests' listening ears. "I told you not to come back here. You are ruining everything." Before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my jacket, my lead security guard stepped forward. He planted his massive chest directly in Richard's path, effortlessly blocking the physical assault. Richard collided with the guard and stumbled backward, his absolute shock freezing him in place. He looked up at the towering security contractor, his arrogant bluster rapidly evaporating into sheer panic. "You need to step back, sir," the security guard stated, his voice a low rumbling warning that echoed in the silent room. Preston finally looked up from the ring light display. His jaw dropped. The smug, victorious smirk he had worn since breaking into my apartment yesterday was entirely gone, replaced by the distinct, frantic realization that he was completely outmatched. Jasmine let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her lace handkerchief to her chest, entirely confused by the sudden disruption of her exclusive, highly orchestrated magazine interview. I did not look at my father. I did not acknowledge my mother's shattered tray or Preston's terrified stare. I stepped easily around Richard's frozen form, moving with cold, undeniable authority. I walked straight up to Jasmine's meticulously staged interview area. The lifestyle reporter stared up at me, her eyes wide with journalistic shock and curiosity. I stepped directly in front of the blinding ring light. I reached out and pulled the tall, sleek microphone stand toward me. I tapped the metal grill twice with my index finger. The sharp percussive thumps echoed loudly through the mansion's integrated sound system. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the frozen crowd. "I will only take a minute. I have a few holiday gifts to distribute." The echo of my tapping on the microphone faded into an absolute suffocating silence. 60 of Connecticut's most elite socialites, politicians, and business moguls stared at me, their champagne flutes frozen in midair. The lifestyle reporter sitting across from Jasmine lowered her digital recorder, her eyes darting frantically between me and my furious family. Jasmine sat perfectly still on her velvet ottoman, the lace handkerchief still pressed dramatically to her dry cheek, completely unsure of how to proceed with her fabricated tragedy. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I did not let a single tear blur my vision. I maintained a posture of pure surgical precision. The time for emotional bargaining was completely over. I looked directly at my mother. Patricia was still standing by the massive stone fireplace, surrounded by the shattered remains of her crystal serving tray and ruined appetizers. Her face was chalk white under the harsh glare of the remaining lights. "Mom, you told me I was out of the family," I said, letting the words carry clearly through the pristine integrated sound system. "You made it explicitly clear that my presence was no longer required or desired, unless I surrendered my personal assets to cover your massive, continuous mistakes." I took a slow, deliberate breath, watching her eyes widen in terror. "So I terminated the family payroll." Patricia swayed heavily on her feet. She reached out with a trembling, manicured hand, gripping the stone mantel for physical support. Her mouth worked silently, unable to form words. The elite guests surrounding her immediately began to whisper. The facade of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch was cracking in real time. I watched the realization wash over her perfectly lifted face. The platinum credit cards, the exclusive country club memberships, the imported floral arrangements, and the luxury car leases were all gone. I had systematically severed every single financial artery, keeping their fake lifestyle alive. "You have been spending my money for years," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "But today, the charity permanently ends." Richard finally found his voice. He strained against the massive chest of my security guard, his face a violent, throbbing shade of purple. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut around his leg. "Do not listen to her!" Richard bellowed to the crowd, spit flying from his lips as he struggled against the unmoving contractor. She is having a psychotic breakdown. She is delusional. Someone call the police and have her removed from my property. I turned away from my mother and faced the sea of guests. These were people who had looked down on me for years, viewing me as the rigid, boring daughter who lacked the effortless grace and charm of her prominent parents. For 4 years, I paid for this house, the cars, the vacations I announced, projecting my voice over my father's frantic shouting. Because when my father went bankrupt in 2019 due to illegal gambling, I was the only one who bailed him out. A collective gasp rippled through the sunken living room. The town mayor, who had been laughing and drinking with Patricia just minutes earlier, took 2 distinct steps away from her, as if she were suddenly contagious. Several other prominent guests mirrored his movement, physically distancing themselves. The whispers escalated into a chaotic, buzzing murmur. Richard's illegal sports betting and offshore gambling debts had been a tightly guarded secret, a shameful reality they had buried under millions of dollars of my hard-earned wealth. I wiped out $3 million of his illicit debt, I stated, laying out the cold hard facts for the entire room to digest. I saved them from federal prosecution and complete social ruin. And in return, they spent today trying to blackmail me with a fake miscarriage story. Jasmine let out a genuine shriek, this time dropping her handkerchief. The reporter beside her immediately began typing furiously on her tablet, recognizing that this was the journalistic story of the decade. Preston stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked wildly at the crowd, realizing his entire social standing and fake entrepreneurial image was evaporating in seconds. "This is a lie," Preston yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "This is our house. We own everything. You are just jealous because you have nothing." I turned my head slightly and nodded to the unassuming man in the beige trench coat standing patiently behind me. The process server stepped smoothly around the private security guards. He did not look intimidated by the extreme wealth or the massive audience. He was purely professional, a man simply executing his assigned job. He walked directly up to my father. Richard tried to step back, but the security guard held him firmly in place. The process server raised the thick manila envelope and slapped it firmly against Richard's heaving chest. "You are hereby served with a 3-day notice to vacate the server," announced, his voice ringing out with absolute legal authority. "This property belongs to Stella's LLC. The envelope hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. Richard stared down at it, his entire body trembling with a mixture of blinding rage and stark terror. He knew the document was real. He knew I possessed the original deed. The guests were completely silent again, captivated by the absolute destruction of a Connecticut dynasty. Preston lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. He bypassed the stunned reporter, knocking the heavy ring light over in his blind fury. The equipment crashed onto the floor, shattering the expensive bulb. He lunged directly toward me, his face twisted in a manic, violent rage. "You lying bitch!" Preston screamed, charging up the marble steps with his arms raised. "I own 50% of this house." My security guards instantly shifted, stepping in front of me to intercept his charge. But before Preston could even reach the first step, a massive, deafening crash echoed through the grand foyer behind me. The heavy custom oak front doors were violently kicked open, the reinforced hinges tearing straight out of the doorframe. A flood of harsh flashlight beams cut through the elegant ambient lighting of the mansion. Armed men in dark green tactical gear poured into the entryway, their heavy boots trampling over the pristine marble floor. The sharp, unmistakable sound of assault rifles being racked filled the air, completely freezing Preston in his tracks. The federal agents had arrived early. They surged into the main entryway, their heavy boots crashing against the pristine marble floors with a deafening crack. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move. The command ripped through the Connecticut mansion, delivered by a towering man holding a black rifle. A dozen tactical agents flooded the grand foyer, spreading out with synchronized precision. The 60 high society guests, the town mayor, and the influential developers erupted into panic. Champagne flutes shattered against the floorboards. Women shrieked, dropping their clutch purses. Men in bespoke suits raised their hands, flattening themselves against the silk wallpaper. The quartet had already fled into the kitchen. My two private security contractors immediately stepped back, their hands raised in a very clear, safe gesture to signal their compliance to the federal agents. I stood perfectly still, my posture immaculate, watching the absolute destruction of my parents' fabricated kingdom. The blue and red emergency lights from the fleet of vehicles outside pulsed through the massive bay windows, casting a strobe effect over the Thanksgiving decorations. Special Agent Thomas Carter strode through the entryway, his badge displayed prominently on his chest. He zeroed in on the living room, his sharp eyes locking onto the targets we had prepared for. Preston was still frozen on the third marble step, his fist half raised toward me. He did not even have the chance to lower his arm. Two heavily armored agents flanked him instantly. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his cashmere sweater, hauling him backward with unyielding force. Preston thrashed, letting out a loud yelp of surprise. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed, kicking wildly. "Do you know who my father is?" The agents did not care about Richard's status. They propelled Preston directly toward the dining room, their boots slipping slightly on the spilled appetizers. With a synchronized heave, they slammed Preston face first onto the polished marble dining table. The impact was spectacular. Preston's face planted squarely into the perfectly roasted Thanksgiving turkey. Hot gravy and cranberry sauce splashed across the linen tablecloth. He choked, spitting out stuffing and turkey meat as the agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back. "Preston Wilson, you are under arrest," one of the agents barked, snapping steel handcuffs shut around my brother's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You are being charged with 3 counts of felony wire fraud, identity theft, across state lines, and federal bank fraud." Preston thrashed against the marble, his face smeared with grease and turkey fat, sobbing hysterically as the Miranda rights echoed through the silent, terrified crowd. Patricia completely snapped. The sight of her golden child face down in a roasted bird utterly broke her brain. She let out an unearthly feral scream and lunged toward the dining room, her diamond bracelets clinking wildly. "Get off him!" Patricia shrieked, clawing frantically at the back of the federal agent's tactical vest. "He is a good boy. You are making a mistake. She is the criminal." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hysterical hatred. "Stella is a psychopath. She framed us. She fabricated those documents because she is jealous of our success. Arrest her!" Special Agent Carter stepped smoothly into Patricia's path, holding up a steady, commanding hand. "Ma'am, you need to step back immediately," Carter ordered, his voice remarkably calm despite the absolute chaos. Patricia refused to listen. She grabbed a heavy silver gravy boat from the table and raised it above her head, ready to strike the agent pinning her son. Carter moved with blinding speed. He caught her wrist, twisting the gravy boat from her grip before it could connect. The silver vessel clattered loudly against the floor. "Ma'am, you are listed as the primary notary on the forged federal loan documents," Carter stated, his tone dropping an octave into absolute freezing authority. "We have the digital fingerprint of your illegal stamp and the offshore wire transfers proving your conspiracy. Put your hands behind your back." Patricia froze. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze came out. Another agent stepped up behind her, swiftly securing her wrists in cuffs. She sagged against the dining table, weeping loudly as the reality of a 5-year minimum federal prison sentence crashed down upon her. Richard was already pinned against the fireplace by 2 other agents, his face buried in his hands, defeated. Across the room, Jasmine suddenly realized the digital recorder and the ring light camera were still actively broadcasting to her thousands of social media followers. The lifestyle reporter was frantically snapping photos on her smartphone. Jasmine instantly dropped to her knees on the velvet ottoman, deciding to double down on the blackmail scheme. She threw her head back, letting out a theatrical wail that cut through the sounds of the arrests. My baby Jasmine screamed, clutching her flat stomach in an exaggerated display of agony. "You are stressing my baby. The federal agents, the violent arrests, this is too much trauma. You are murdering my child. I am going to miscarry right now." The reporter gasped, turning her camera directly onto Jasmine's sobbing face. The high society guests murmured in horrified shock, clearly buying into the tragic performance. Jasmine looked at me through her fake tears, a momentary flash of smug victory hidden in her eyes. She thought she had won the public relations war. She thought she had just successfully branded me as a monster on a live viral feed. I did not say a word. I smoothly opened my leather portfolio and pulled out my sleek silver iPad. I tapped the screen, entering my passcode with measured, unhurried movements. I bypassed the hysterical crowd and walked directly to the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the stone fireplace. I pulled a digital connector cable from my jacket pocket, plugging my tablet directly into the primary entertainment system. The massive, breathtaking 80-inch smart television mounted above the stone fireplace flickered to life. The crisp, high-definition screen instantly mirrored my encrypted tablet, casting a bright, sterile glow across the chaotic living room. Jasmine abruptly stopped wailing. Her dramatic performance faltered as the heavy gaze of 60 elite guests shifted from her tear-streaked face to the glowing display. I slowly tapped the glass screen once, bringing up the first piece of evidence. A collective, unbelievably sharp gasp immediately rippled through the crowd of politicians and socialites. Displayed in striking side-by-side clarity was the irrefutable truth. On the left side of the massive screen was Jasmine's highly edited, emotionally manipulative Instagram post from last month, featuring the grainy black and white ultrasound image she claimed was her unborn child. On the right side was the exact same ultrasound. It was uncropped, entirely unfiltered, and featured a distinct watermark. The original image belonged to a popular parenting blog run by a woman in Ohio, and the upload date was clearly stamped as October 2021. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic clicking of the lifestyle reporter's camera shutter. She had completely abandoned the staged interview and was now actively documenting the digital destruction of a major social media influencer. Jasmine's mouth hung open in silent horror, her contoured face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. The lace handkerchief slipped from her trembling fingers and drifted to the Persian rug. I tapped the glass screen of my tablet a second time. The image on the television shifted seamlessly to the next slide. It was a highly confidential, heavily redacted surgical record obtained by my private intelligence contractor. I highlighted the crucial, indisputable text in bright yellow. It clearly detailed a voluntary tubal ligation procedure. The date of the surgery was exactly 3 years ago. "It is a miracle, Jasmine," I said, my voice ringing with cold authority over the silent crowd. "An immaculate conception." Jasmine lunged forward with a sudden, desperate shriek. She scrambled toward the towering ring light, her manicured hands clawing frantically at the tripod in a wild attempt to knock her smartphone to the ground and sever the live broadcast. She was too late. The damage was already permanently inflicted. Her phone, still perfectly framed and capturing every agonizing second of her exposure, showed the live chat scrolling at blinding speed. Thousands of viewers were watching her public execution in real time. The live chat feed was an absolute, unmitigated massacre. Loyal followers were instantly turning on her, flooding the screen with angry, disgusted comments. But the real devastation was happening on a corporate level. Jasmine's entire livelihood depended on lucrative brand partnerships and sponsorships built on her wholesome, luxurious domestic image. In the span of 30 seconds, that carefully curated empire completely vaporized. Major maternity brands and luxury fashion sponsors were actively dropping her in the live chat. Verified corporate accounts typed out immediate cancellations of her promotional contracts. Her digital career was being actively dismantled before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it. Preston remained pinned against the ruined Thanksgiving dinner by the federal agents. His face was still smeared with congealed gravy and cranberry sauce. He craned his neck, straining against the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists to stare at the massive television screen. His eyes darted wildly between the stolen Ohio ultrasound and the verified surgical records, proving his fiancée was physically incapable of carrying a child. The sheer magnitude of the deception finally penetrated his arrogant, entitled brain. "You have been lying to me for 2 years!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with genuine shock. He thrashed violently against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, entirely forgetting his own impending felony wire fraud charges. The ultimate con artist had just realized he was the victim of a spectacularly long con. Jasmine had manipulated him flawlessly. She had faked a pregnancy to secure her place in a wealthy family, and she had gleefully participated in a vile extortion plot against me, entirely based on a biological impossibility. Preston stared at her with raw, unfiltered hatred, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "You told me we were starting a family." Preston sobbed, the reality of his complete destruction finally breaking his spirit. "You made me break into my sister's house to steal money for a baby that does not even exist. You ruined my entire life for a lie." Jasmine stopped wrestling with the heavy ring light. She stood up straight, smoothing the front of her somber gray dress with trembling, rigid hands. The fake victimized persona vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating opportunist she truly was. She looked at Preston, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits. The realization that her influencer career was dead, her reputation was shattered, and her wealthy fiancé was currently in federal custody sparked a vicious, immediate counterattack. She did not show a single ounce of remorse for the massive deception she had orchestrated. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at Preston's grease-stained face. "I want a divorce!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous living room. "I only married you because you said you had a massive trust fund. You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me your family owned half the commercial real estate in the state. I spent 2 years listening to your pathetic business pitches and putting up with your overbearing, critical mother because you promised me a life of endless luxury. But you are a complete fraud. You are entirely broke." The federal agents tightened their grip on Preston as he let out a guttural howl of fury. He lunged forward again in blind desperation, trying to break free and reach her, his shoes slipping wildly on the ruined appetizers scattered across the floor, entirely consumed by the absolute devastating wreckage of his own magnificent, pathetic lies. The initial explosion of the federal raid rapidly transitioned into a highly synchronized clinical operation. The high society guests who had previously sipped vintage champagne were scrambling toward the exits, fleeing the imploding Connecticut dynasty. The string quartet had completely vanished, leaving behind only knocked-over music stands and a single abandoned cello. In the center of the grand dining room, the Thanksgiving feast was an active crime scene. Evidence markers were placed next to the shattered crystal platters, and the turkey grease smeared across the marble floor. Flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the lawn in frantic colors. Special Agent Thomas Carter stood near the foyer, calmly directing his team as they began securing digital devices and boxing up physical documents from my father's home office. The air was thick with the sharp scent of spilled wine and pure terror. Richard stood paralyzed against the stone fireplace, his chest heaving rapidly beneath his ruined bespoke suit. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the absolute destruction of his fabricated empire. He watched 2 federal agents haul a sobbing Preston up from the floor, his face covered in congealed gravy. Another agent forcefully secured the steel handcuffs around Patricia's wrists, the metal clicking with a sharp, unforgiving finality. He was looking down the barrel of a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. He knew exactly what a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary would mean for a man who had spent his entire life demanding luxury and avoiding hard work. He was going to lose his country club memberships and his freedom. The cowardice that had always defined my father instantly clawed its way to the surface. He did not step forward to defend her. He did not attempt to comfort his ruined son. Instead, he locked eyes with Special Agent Carter and violently shoved Patricia under the bus. It was Patricia! Richard shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at his wife, backing away from her as if she were a live grenade. I had nothing to do with those loan documents. She forged the notary stamp. I told her it was a terrible idea. I told her not to do it, but she refused to listen to me. She said Stella would just pay it off like she always does. She is the mastermind behind the entire scheme. The sheer velocity of the betrayal stunned even the federal agents. They paused, looking between the panicked patriarch and his newly arrested wife. Patricia stopped thrashing against the agent holding her arms. Her head snapped toward Richard, her eyes wide with a level of shock that rapidly morphed into absolute, unfiltered rage. The elegant mask of the wealthy Connecticut matriarch completely disintegrated. She bared her teeth, looking entirely feral as she strained against the steel cuffs cutting into her wrists. "You pathetic, spineless coward!" Patricia shrieked, the sound tearing through her throat. She lunged forward, nearly dragging the federal agent with her as she tried to physically attack her husband. "You are blaming me. You begged me to fix your messes. You came crying to me when your illegal offshore gambling accounts were frozen. You are a weak, useless man who has never succeeded at a single thing in your entire miserable life without my help. I forged that stamp to save you from your own pathetic failures. I warned you about the risks," Richard yelled back, retreating until his back hit the cold stone of the fireplace. "I told you Stella would find out. You are the one who insisted we could force her into paying. You drove this family into the ground with your psychotic need to control everything. I am fully cooperating with the authorities. I will testify against you if they ask. You will not survive a day without my money to hide your incompetence." Patricia roared, her face a terrifying shade of red. She kicked out blindly, her designer heel catching the edge of a mahogany side table and sending a priceless vase crashing to the floor. "You are nothing. You are a parasite. I did everything for this family while you played golf and lost millions." I stood silently near the doorway, watching the glorious, catastrophic implosion of the people who had tortured me for 30 years. The perfect family illusion was dead scattered in tiny, irreparable pieces across the ruined carpet. They were cornered rats, viciously tearing each other apart to save themselves, willing to destroy the person they supposedly loved most, to shave a few years off their impending prison sentences. The absolute loyalty they had always demanded from me did not even exist between them. Special Agent Carter let out a sharp whistle. "That is enough," he barked, gesturing to the agents flanking the furious couple. "Get them out of here. Separate vehicles. We will sort out the confessions at the field office." The agents moved with practiced efficiency. They grabbed Richard by the biceps, spinning him around and slamming his hands behind his back. Richard gasped, his knees buckling as the cold steel clamped down on his wrists. He began weeping instantly, a pathetic whimpering sound echoing through the foyer. Simultaneously, two agents gripped Patricia's arms forcefully, marching her toward the shattered front doors. Her heels dragged against the marble as she fought them every step of the way. As they hauled her past the spot where I stood, her wild, desperate eyes suddenly locked onto mine. The feral rage completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization of her actual predicament. The squad cars were waiting outside. The federal holding cells were real. "Stella, please," Patricia begged, digging her heels into the floor to stop her forward momentum. Her voice was suddenly high, fragile, and laced with absolute terror. "You have to pay the bail. You cannot let them put me in a cell. We are your parents, Stella. Please, you cannot let them take us." The echo of my mother's desperate, shrill plea hung in the ruined foyer. Her terrified eyes locked onto mine, silently begging for the unconditional financial rescue she had always demanded as her absolute right. The chaotic, buzzing energy of the room suddenly evaporated into a heavy, suffocating silence. The 60 elite guests, the federal agents, the lifestyle reporter, and even my violently thrashing brother, all froze collectively, holding their breath to witness my response. I did not blink. I did not offer a comforting smile. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer and walked slowly down the marble steps toward the woman who had spent 30 years tearing me down. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, each measured footstep sounding like a judge's gavel striking a heavy wooden block. The two federal agents gripping Patricia's arms instinctively loosened their hold, just a fraction, allowing me to close the final few feet between us. Patricia leaned forward, a pathetic, desperate spark of hope suddenly igniting in her tear-streaked mascara-smeared face. She genuinely believed her last-minute emotional manipulation had worked. She actually thought the unbreakable toxic bond of family loyalty was about to save her from a federal holding cell. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from her, inhaling the sharp metallic scent of her fear, mixed with her expensive French perfume. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer more hollow promises, but I raised a single silencing hand. When I was 20 years old, I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft, yet projecting it perfectly through the dead silence of the room. I begged you for $500 to pay for my college textbooks. I worked 3 grueling jobs, but I was still short, and I was absolutely terrified of failing my advanced finance courses. I watched the distinct memory flash across her wide, panicked eyes. You looked directly at me. I continued, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. You casually swiped your platinum credit card, bought yourself a $2,000 Prada bag right in front of me, and you told me that failures figure it out. Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. She tried to reach out to grab my sleeve with her cuffed hands, but the tactical agent pulled her firmly back into place. You told me I lacked the grace and basic intelligence to survive in your prominent world, I stated, staring coldly at her trembling lips. You spent my entire adult life treating me like a disposable bank account, a convenient safety net for your endless catastrophic mistakes, while constantly treating Preston like an untouchable king. Now the safety net is permanently gone. You demanded that I figure it out, Mom. So today I am simply returning the favor. Figure it out. I did not wait for her response. I did not want to hear another fabricated excuse or another vicious, desperate insult. I simply turned my back on her and walked away. The absolute finality of the movement shattered whatever tiny fragment of hope she had left in her dark heart. Patricia let out a devastating guttural wail, a horrific sound of absolute, unmitigated despair. "Take them out!" Special Agent Carter ordered, his booming voice breaking the frozen spell that had paralyzed the entire room. The agent surged forward forcefully, marching Patricia, Richard, and a completely shell-shocked Preston through the shattered front doors. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked against the doorframe as they were shoved out into the freezing Connecticut night. Jasmine, quickly recognizing that her meal ticket was gone and her reputation was entirely destroyed, scrambled past the agents. She frantically hid her face from the flashing cameras as she sprinted toward her leased luxury car. I looked at the 2 private security contractors standing patiently by the grand staircase. "Clear the property," I instructed them calmly. "The party is officially over." The remaining high society guests did not need to be told twice. The town mayor, the influential developers, and the terrified socialites scrambled for their expensive winter coats. They abandoned their ruined luxury vehicles and actively marched down the long driveway to avoid the federal blockade. They whispered frantically, their eyes darting toward me with a newfound mixture of absolute terror and undeniable respect. The rigid, boring daughter they had mocked for years had just single-handedly dismantled the most powerful family in their elite social circle. Within 20 minutes, the federal agents had finished boxing up Richard's private files and confiscating the hidden hard drives. Carter gave me a brief professional nod of silent acknowledgement before stepping out into the biting cold and pulling the damaged oak doors shut behind him. The massive convoy of federal cruisers and black tactical vehicles slowly rolled down the long, winding driveway. I stood completely still, watching the strobing red and blue emergency lights reflect off the snow-covered oak trees, gradually fading into the dark, silent night. I stood completely alone in the center of the opulent, cavernous mansion. The silence was incredibly profound, a heavy, peaceful blanket settling over the absolute wreckage of my dark past. I slowly walked into the grand dining room to observe the battlefield. The Thanksgiving feast was entirely destroyed. Preston's deep face print was still visibly smashed into the center of the roasted turkey. Smashed crystal, spilled wine, and overturned silver platters littered the marble floor. It was a beautiful, chaotic masterpiece of absolute justice. I had successfully severed the toxic anchor that had mercilessly dragged me down for 3 entire decades. The enormous house was finally mine, perfectly quiet and blissfully empty. Suddenly, the sharp vibration of my phone buzzed. I slowly pulled it from my blazer pocket. It was a direct text from my CEO. Saw the news, the glowing message read, "The audit cleared you. Let's talk about that VP promotion on Monday." I locked the screen, slipping it away, and smiled into the silent, victorious room. The Monday following the Thanksgiving raid brought the final validation I had relentlessly worked toward. My CEO did not just offer me the vice president position, he handed me the entire Eastern Regional Division. The promotion was a profound, tangible confirmation that my dedication and strict ethical boundaries had paid off perfectly. From that elevated vantage point, the next 3 months passed with blinding, glorious speed. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying, crushing momentum when the evidence is absolutely irrefutable. Preston learned this harsh lesson in a sterile federal courtroom during his heavily publicized sentencing hearing. His expensive defense attorney, paid for by the final scraps of Richard's hidden accounts, could do absolutely nothing against the mountain of digital evidence we provided. The judge looked down at my brother with undisguised contempt and handed down a severe sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary, strictly without the possibility of parole. Preston collapsed at the defense table, sobbing loudly for our mother, completely unable to process that his pampered, entitled existence had permanently ended. There would be no country club dinners or luxury car leases in federal lockup. He was just another inmate now, stripped of his fabricated superiority and forced to face reality. Jasmine's spectacular downfall was equally swift and completely public. Her desperate attempt to divorce Preston and distance herself from the criminal fallout failed to save her lifestyle. The prenuptial agreement she had eagerly signed was entirely worthless because the staggering wealth she thought she was marrying into was an absolute mirage. She walked away from the brief marriage with absolutely nothing but staggering legal fees and a shattered reputation. Her influencer empire evaporated overnight. Every single sponsor dropped her, and the internet ruthlessly turned her into a viral joke. With zero income and no marketable skills, reality crashed down on her hard. My private intelligence contractor spotted her last week working the drive-through window at a greasy fast food chain 2 towns over. She was wearing a stained uniform and a visor pulled down extremely low over her face, frantically hiding her identity from former fans who occasionally recognized her. The cruel woman who had confidently tried to destroy me with a fake pregnancy was now asking impatient strangers if they wanted fries with their meal, utterly terrified of ending up on another viral social media post, highlighting her spectacular demise. Richard and Patricia faced a different kind of total destruction. Their high-priced legal team managed to negotiate a highly restrictive plea deal that barely kept them out of a federal prison cell. However, the ultimate cost of their physical freedom was their complete and absolute financial ruin. The federal government mercilessly seized every single asset they possessed to cover the massive punitive fines and the court-ordered restitution. The massive Connecticut mansion was immediately repossessed by the bank and put up for public auction. Their luxury vehicles were towed away on flatbed trucks while the neighbors watched. The platinum credit cards were permanently deactivated. They were systematically stripped of their elite status, their exclusive country club memberships, and their wealthy friends who all scattered like roaches the moment the federal indictments dropped. Without my hard-earned money to artificially prop them up, they plummeted straight to the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. They were forced to move into a cheap rundown motel on the dark outskirts of the city, living week to week on whatever tiny scraps of cash they could scrape together. The untouchable patriarch and the snobbish matriarch were now sharing a single cramped room with peeling yellow wallpaper and a dripping faucet entirely consumed by the devastating consequences of their lifelong greed and rampant narcissism. They had nothing left but each other, and they despised every second of it. I was reviewing quarterly financial projections in my spacious new corner office when my attorney Diane knocked softly on the heavy glass door. She stepped inside the room carrying a thick manila folder and wearing a deeply satisfied smile. The panoramic view of the bustling city skyline behind my mahogany desk served as the perfect backdrop for finally closing this dark chapter. Diane took a seat across from me and laid the folder squarely on my pristine glass desk. "The audit is completely finalized," she announced, her voice filled with professional triumph. "The bank initially tried to come after you for the $1.5 million loan your parents fraudulently secured. They aggressively attempted to hold your LLC accountable for the massive default." I nodded slowly, remembering the initial barrage of threatening letters from the bank's aggressive legal department. "But the FBI investigation entirely exonerated you," Diane continued, opening the folder to reveal the official federal clearance documents with absolute certainty. Special Agent Carter provided a comprehensive report detailing your complete lack of involvement. He perfectly outlined how Patricia forged your digital signature and notary stamp, and exactly how Richard orchestrated the illegal wire transfers. "The bank has officially dropped all claims against you and your businesses entirely. You are completely in the clear, Stella. Your financial and legal standing is absolutely flawless and heavily protected." I let out a slow, steady breath, feeling the final lingering weight lift completely off my tired shoulders. The brutal war was officially over, and I had undeniably won. But Diane did not close the folder. Instead, she reached deep into her black leather briefcase and pulled out a small, incredibly battered white envelope. The edges were heavily crumpled, and it looked exactly like it had been frantically carried around in a dirty coat pocket for several miserable days. She pushed it across the smooth glass desk directly toward me. "Your parents were evicted today from the squalid motel they were staying in," Diane said quietly, watching my reaction carefully. "They sent this." I slowly reached out my right hand and took the battered, dirty envelope, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, permanent indifference toward the two toxic people who had created me. The heavy paper of the envelope felt rough and grimy against my manicured fingers. It was a stark contrast to the sleek glass of my executive desk and the polished mahogany surrounding me. A faint stench of stale smoke and cheap lemon cleaner clung to the crumpled edges. This was the scent of their new reality, the smell of desperation and absolute ruin. I stared at my name scribbled across the front in Richard's chaotic, trembling handwriting. The ink was smeared perhaps by tears, or perhaps just by the unsanitary conditions of the roadside motel they were currently haunting. Diane sat perfectly still across from me, her professional eyes watching my face for any sign of emotional fracture. She was ready to intervene, ready to protect me legally, but she did not know the woman who craved this family's approval was dead. I slid my silver letter opener under the damaged flap and sliced it open with a single smooth motion. The letter inside was written on thin, cheap-lined paper, completely unlike the monogrammed stationery Patricia used to order from Paris. I unfolded the pages, the harsh rustle echoing in the quiet office. My eyes scanned the frantic, crowded lines of text. It was a pathetic, desperate plea from Richard, a rambling documentation of their spectacular misery. He did not start with an apology for the decades of abuse, nor did he express genuine remorse for attempting to ruin my life. Instead, he immediately launched into a miserable catalog of their physical suffering. He detailed the squalid living conditions of their new room, complaining bitterly about the drafty windows letting the freezing Connecticut wind howl through the thin walls. He whined about the lack of edible food, describing their daily meals of processed microwave dinners and instant noodles. The man who used to send back an expensive steak because it was cooked slightly above medium rare was now crying over cheap soup. The most absurd section of the letter was dedicated to Patricia. Richard devoted an entire page to describing how his wife was suffering a mental breakdown, unable to cope without her country club friends. He wrote that Patricia spent her days sitting on a sagging mattress, weeping uncontrollably because the women in their elite circle had blocked her phone number. She was entirely isolated, cut off from the gossip, the luxury, and the false adoration that had sustained her empty soul for 30 years. He begged me to understand how fragile she was, pleading for me to send a monthly stipend just so she could visit a salon and feel human again. They honestly believed their loss of luxury was a profound tragedy. They were blind to the fact that they were experiencing the exact same grinding poverty they had threatened to trap me in. I continued reading the frantic scrawl until I reached the bottom of the second page. Here Richard shifted his tactics from begging to blatant emotional manipulation. He tried to invoke nostalgic debt, hoping to trigger the vulnerable little girl he thought still lived inside my head. I read the line twice to make sure I was not hallucinating the sheer audacity of his words. "Please, Stella." He wrote, the ink pressing deeply into the paper. "Remember the bicycle I bought you when you were 6. Remember how hard I worked to give you a good childhood. You owe us for the sacrifices we made to raise you." I let out a sharp, genuine scoff that startled Diane. She shifted in her leather chair, raising an eyebrow in silent question. "He actually has the nerve to bring up the bicycle," I said, tossing the letter onto the desk with pure disgust. The pages slid across the glass, coming to a stop near Diane's briefcase. "Richard is trying to manipulate me by reminding me of the pink bicycle he supposedly bought me when I was 6 years old." Diane leaned forward, her expression a mix of professional curiosity and personal sympathy. "I assume he did not actually buy it?" she asked, knowing enough about my history to anticipate the deception. "He did not buy it." I confirmed, my voice cold and hard as steel. "He stole it. He stole it directly from a neighbor's yard 3 blocks over. I was a child, but I remember him dragging it into our garage in the dead of night. He spent 3 hours frantically repainting it with cheap pink spray paint to cover up the original blue color and hide the identifying stickers. He slapped a poorly tied ribbon on the handlebars and presented it to me the next morning, acting like a devoted hero who had spent his hard-earned money to make his daughter smile. It was stolen property given to me by a coward who was too busy gambling away his paycheck to buy a legitimate gift. That is the grand paternal gesture he is using to extort money from me today." Diane shook her head in sheer disbelief, her lips pressing into a tight line. "The delusion is staggering," she noted, tapping the edge of the letter with her pen. "Do you want me to send a cease and desist? I can draft a legally binding document immediately threatening harassment charges if they attempt to contact you again." I looked down at the pathetic pages resting on my immaculate desk. "No," I said softly, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Let them write, let them hope, let them waste their stamps." Diane nodded, packing her documents back into her briefcase and snapping the brass locks shut. Just as she stood up to leave, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass desktop. The screen lit up with a sudden high-priority notification. The Connecticut mansion had officially sold at the federal foreclosure auction for $4.2 million. The surplus money finally hit my corporate holding account with irrefutable finality. I was richer than ever, and they had absolutely nothing. The 9-digit figure on my app was absolute freedom. Within 2 days of the transfer hitting my account, I delegated the final tasks to my team, packed 2 trunks, and boarded a first-class flight across the Atlantic. I was taking a month-long sabbatical before stepping into my new role as Vice President of the Eastern Division. For 3 decades, my toxic family had drained my energy bank accounts and soul. Now I was reclaiming my time on my exact terms. Paris in the early spring possessed a crisp electric energy that perfectly matched my internal rebirth. I sat at a premier corner table on the terrace of a highly exclusive cafe directly overlooking the magnificent iron lattice of the Eiffel Tower. The Parisian sun warmed my face as a white-gloved sommelier smoothly poured a pristine 1998 vintage champagne into 3 crystal flutes. The golden liquid sparkled brightly, sending tiny ribbons of bubbles racing toward the surface. I raised my glass, listening to the delicate chime as it met the glasses of the 2 women sitting across from me. Chloe and Maya were my college roommates, the women who had shared cheap ramen noodles with me when Patricia refused to pay for my meal plan. They were the ones who had stayed up until 4 in the morning quizzing me for my finance exams, and the ones who had fiercely guarded my mental health whenever Richard called to demand a piece of my meager barista paycheck. They were my chosen family. They had earned their seats at this luxurious table through years of unwavering, unconditional loyalty. To the Empire, Chloe said, her dark eyes flashing with fierce, genuine pride as she took a slow sip of the exquisite vintage. To the architect, who finally burned down the rotting castle, Maya added, raising her glass slightly higher. I smiled, the expression feeling completely natural and unforced on my face for the first time in years. The sommelier returned silently, placing a chilled silver platter on our table. It held a generous portion of beluga caviar, resting on a bed of crushed ice, accompanied by warm blinis and small spoons. I scooped a delicate portion of the dark glistening pearls onto a blini, savoring the rich, buttery, oceanic flavor as it melted perfectly on my tongue. The pure decadence of the moment was intoxicating. 6,000 miles away in the harsh fluorescent glare of a federal penitentiary, my brother was experiencing a completely different culinary reality. Preston was currently wearing a stiff, scratchy orange jumpsuit that smelled permanently of industrial bleach and stale sweat. His soft manicured hands, which had previously only held vintage Scotch glasses, and the keys to leased sports cars, were now submerged in a massive basin of scalding greasy dishwater. He was furiously scrubbing crusted baked beans off hundreds of plastic cafeteria trays. His supervisor, a massive, unsympathetic man serving 20 years for armed robbery, barked brutal orders at him whenever he slowed down. There was no mother to run to, no father to write a massive check to make the uncomfortable situation magically disappear. Preston had 8 miserable years of scrubbing, sweeping, and bowing his head to survive. The golden boy was gone, replaced by inmate number 87429. Entirely stripped of his fabricated superiority and utterly alone in a cold concrete cage, I took another sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, complex notes wash over my palate. Maya leaned back in her wrought iron chair, adjusting her designer sunglasses. She looked in her element, thriving in the lavish environment I was now able to easily provide for the people I actually loved. You know, Maya began selecting a fresh strawberry from the tiered silver tray between us. I honestly thought you would have kept the Connecticut house just to tear it down and build something new. I shook my head, setting my crystal flute back down on the immaculate white linen tablecloth. That property was poisoned, I explained, looking out at the beautiful Parisian architecture surrounding us. The soil was completely toxic. You cannot plant a new garden in a graveyard built on lies and manipulation. Selling it to a stranger was the ultimate purification. I took their stolen empire and converted it into cold, hard capital. Capital that funds this exact moment. Chloe reached across the table and squeezed my hand firmly. You did the right thing, Stella. You excised a malignant tumor. You are finally breathing healthy air. She was absolutely right. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had lived in the center of my chest since childhood had completely vanished. I did not owe anyone a fraction of my success. I did not have to constantly look over my shoulder, waiting for a desperate phone call, demanding an immediate wire transfer to cover illegal gambling debts or fraudulent loans. The umbilical cord of guilt and manufactured obligation was permanently severed. I had ruthlessly pruned the dead branches from my life, and now I was reclaiming my time on my exact terms. The afternoon stretched out before us, filled with promises of exclusive boutique shopping, a private boat tour down the Seine, and a dinner reservation at a Michelin-starred restaurant tucked away in a historic arrondissement. I was a wealthy, successful vice president with a flawless reputation and a brilliant future. I was completely untouchable. A sharp, sudden vibration broke my peaceful reverie. My phone resting face down next to my silver caviar spoon buzzed urgently against the hard table. I ignored it initially, assuming it was a minor logistical email from my transition team back in the city. However, it buzzed a second time, then a third, maintaining a relentless, demanding rhythm that felt strangely familiar. I slowly reached out and flipped the device over, shielding the bright, glaring screen from the brilliant afternoon sun. The caller ID displayed a 10-digit number that I did not have saved. It was an unknown Connecticut phone number. I slowly slid my index finger under the grimy seal of the battered envelope, tearing the cheap yellowed paper open. Inside was a single folded sheet of lined notebook paper, completely covered in Richard's frantic, erratic, and barely legible handwriting. It was certainly not an apology. It was a pathetic, desperate plea, wrapped in a miserable catalog of their newfound misery. He detailed their squalid living conditions with agonizing specificity, complaining bitterly about the freezing drafts in their rundown motel room and the severe lack of edible food. The arrogant, entitled man who used to loudly send back perfectly cooked steaks at five-star restaurants was now furiously whining about surviving on cheap, lukewarm instant noodles. An entire paragraph was dedicated to Patricia. Richard claimed she was suffering a severe mental breakdown, sobbing endlessly on a sagging mattress, because she could not survive without her country club friends. He begged me to send a monthly stipend so she could visit a salon and feel human again. They were completely oblivious to their own toxic hypocrisy. Then came the blatant emotional manipulation. I read the final lines out loud to Diane. "Please, Stella," he wrote. "Remember the bicycle I bought you when you were 6. Remember how hard I worked to give you a good childhood. You owe us for the sacrifices we made to raise you." I let out a sharp, genuine scoff that startled Diane. "He did not buy it," I told her, tossing the pathetic letter onto my pristine glass desk. "He stole it. He stole it directly from a neighbor's yard 3 blocks over. I was a child, but I remember him dragging it into our garage in the dead of night. He spent 3 panicked hours frantically repainting the stolen metal frame with cheap, peeling pink spray paint, just to look like a generous, devoted hero the next morning." Diane shook her head in sheer disbelief, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Do you want me to send a cease and desist?" she asked, reaching for her legal pad. "I can draft a binding document immediately." I shook my head, a calm smile spreading across my face. "No. Let them waste their stamps." As Diane packed her briefcase, my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. A high-priority alert flashed across the screen. The Connecticut mansion had officially sold at the federal foreclosure auction for $4.2 million. The massive surplus funds hit my corporate account instantly, the staggering number confirming my absolute financial victory. I was wealthier than ever, and they had absolutely nothing. Exactly 1 month later, I used a fraction of that surplus to fund a luxurious, highly deserved sabbatical before officially starting my new role as vice president of the firm. Paris, in the early spring, possessed a crisp electric energy that perfectly matched my internal rebirth. I sat at a premier corner table on the terrace of a highly exclusive cafe, directly overlooking the magnificent iron lattice of the Eiffel Tower. The Parisian sun warmed my face as a white-gloved sommelier smoothly poured a pristine 1998 vintage champagne into crystal flutes. I was entirely surrounded by my chosen family. Chloe and Maya, my 2 best friends from college, who had supported me when I had absolutely nothing, sat across from me. We raised our tall glasses, toasting to absolute freedom, the delicate chime ringing clearly in the crisp, romantic European air. The sommelier returned silently, placing a chilled silver platter on our table containing a generous portion of beluga caviar. I scooped a delicate portion onto a warm blini, closing my eyes and tasting the rich, buttery flavor as it melted perfectly on my tongue. The sheer decadence of the moment stood in sharp, beautiful contrast to the harsh reality unfolding 6,000 miles away. In a miserable, fluorescent federal penitentiary, my brother was currently wearing a stiff orange jumpsuit. Preston was hunched over a massive basin of scalding, greasy dishwater, furiously scrubbing baked beans off hundreds of plastic cafeteria trays. His supervisor, a massive man serving 20 years, barked brutal orders at him. There was no manipulative mother to run, to no wealthy father to quickly write a massive check to make his miserable problems disappear. Preston was just another forgotten inmate, now completely stripped of his arrogant, fabricated superiority and entirely alone. I took another sip of champagne, letting the complex notes wash over my palate. Suddenly, my phone buzzed sharply against the cafe table. The screen displayed an unknown number from Connecticut. I stared at it for a brief second before pressing the answer button and lifting the phone to my ear. Stella, a raspy, utterly broken voice, pleaded through the tiny receiver. It was Patricia calling from a cheap, prepaid flip phone. Her arrogant tone was completely gone, replaced by unfiltered desperation. "Stella, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I only have $12 to my name. I am so cold and so hungry. I will do absolutely anything. I am your mother." I slowly leaned back in my heavy wrought iron chair, taking a deep breath and gazing calmly at the beautiful Parisian sunset painting the endless sky in vibrant shades of pink, orange, and gold. I felt absolutely no guilt, no lingering sense of obligation, and absolutely zero pity. I spoke with absolute chilling serenity. "You sent a cruel text exactly a year ago explicitly stating I was no longer part of your elite family," I replied softly, my voice perfectly steady. "I am just respecting your wishes, Patricia. Do not ever call this number again." I ended the call immediately without waiting for her panicked response. I permanently blocked the unfamiliar Connecticut number and then tossed the black phone casually into my open designer handbag. I confidently raised my crystal glass of champagne, clinking it gently with my two best friends. I took a slow, refreshing sip, a genuine, completely unburdened smile lighting up my entire face.